Hello, I'm Erin, media producer at Novasia, and today we are going to be talking about the COVID pandemic and perspectives from international students.
So hi everyone, my name is Beckie. I'm a student in first year in GSIS in Korean Studies. I'm also a member of Novasia as a media intern.
First of all, thanks for having me here. I'm Carlos from Spain, and I'm also a first semester in GSIS, Yonsei University.
So can you give me a little bit of background about when you came to Korea and where you were when the pandemic started, all of that?
The first time I came to Korea was actually in 2018, 2019. I was an exchange student here, so I loved my experience so much, and I was like, oh, later on I'm going to come back. So when I had to choose for my master, I decided to apply to come back to Korea. The pandemic happened just before I came here for a second time. So I was still finishing my studies back in Canada when COVID hit, and then I moved in the middle of the pandemic back in Korea.
Same as Beckie, I came to Korea as an exchange student back in 2018, and I spent 1 year and a half, more or less, in Seoul and an intern. Then I went back to Spain just before the pandemic started. That was December 2019. Then I spent the lockdown we had in Spain. And then I came back last year in August,
Okay.
together with Beckie.
And just curious, what university did you do your exchange at?
Oh, I did my exchange in Seoul National University in Seoul. And after when I came back, I was for 1 year in Cormier University in Nonsan, and then now I'm in Yonsei.
Okay, and I spent 3 semesters here as an exchange student, each one in a different university. First was Konkuk University, then Hanguk University of Foreign Studies. Then I moved to Incheon, and I attended Incheon National University. And then last year when I came back, same as Beckie, I was attending Cormier University, like language school.
I was in the US when the pandemic hit. Actually, first I was in China when the pandemic hit, but I came home for the holidays. So it was like towards the end of January that I went back to the US, and I wasn't able to return to China because they closed the border. So I experienced most of the pandemic in the US, and then I also moved to Korea in October 2020. So I experienced some of the pandemic in Korea as well. So what was your experience in Korea during the pandemic?
It was for sure a really different experience than the first time I came because we had to pass through quarantine. So all the mandatory measures that to take PCR tests before coming, to take PCR tests when you are already in the country, to quarantine for me was like 2 weeks. And afterward, it's still a lot of measures to follow, obviously, because there's the government policies, but also our own specific school policies regarding to COVID. Not too difficult to follow, to be honest. It was kind of easy going in the sense that if you follow the measures, then everything will be great, and there's not really any issue. I think it's more of logistics, so it's a lot of things to think about.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely a lot to remember. Like all of the different, I remember at one point, depending on how many people were contracting COVID, there were different rankings that they would give it. So like 1 was like the worst, I think. Then there was 2 and 3 and 4 as well. Things have definitely loosened up, I think, now. But I also had to go through the quarantine, and it was a little bit rough. Like, I don't know, were you in a government facility when you came, or were you in?
No, I was actually in the dorms, but what they did is they separated everyone, so you had the room of the dorm for yourself, so you were not sharing it with anyone. But I mean, later on, I tested the facility center of the government because I did catch COVID later in the pandemic. So I experienced also the facilities. To be honest, the facilities are actually really nice and comfortable. The view also was great because it was kind of in the mountains. But the issue, though, I think with both quarantines for me was also the food, because I can't really eat spicy food. So it's really typical Korean meal. And obviously they don't ask if you have any like specific diet to follow. I think that for our dorm though, they ask if people were vegetarian, so they didn't offer meat to people that were vegetarian. But yeah, no, in the quarantine facility, I kind of like just diet because there's a lot of food I couldn't eat.
In addition to the quarantine and the PCRs and all that stuff, we were quarantined at the airport as soon as we came.
Right.
No, that's true.
Because we came on the same day, actually. And there were also other students, because we are scholars. And if I'm not mistaken, we had to wait for other students coming to the other terminal. So we had to wait for maybe 7-8 hours in the airport, and we were quarantined in the airport. In the arrivals terminal, there was like a place where you can sit, and there were like kind of a fence, and we couldn't leave that place.
Yeah, I actually do remember. I think the same thing happened with me when I came. Like, I got into the airport and we had to go into a specific area, and then, at least for me, like, we didn't have to wait necessarily, but they kind of herded us onto a KTX, and it was like a special car for people who had just traveled there, and like from the airport or from the train station, we got on like special taxis to take us to wherever we were going, which I thought was really impressive how it was so meticulously planned, you know?
I remember also because for us we had to wait for the bus taking us to Nonsan. So I think that because it was also a faraway place and it was our school that was in charge, that's why also we had to wait because they didn't want to go back and forth, you know, for it's a 2 hours and a half bus drive about.
Wow.
So there was not really a possibility to have many timings. So, but in that place where we were waiting, it was barely just benches and nothing else. And if you wanted to go to the bathroom, you had actually to ask the security to, but it was just beside, like 1 meter away.
We're soldiers, actually.
Yeah.
Wow.
Troops, yeah. And also, we were waiting for some guys coming from Africa. I think the South Korean government were not, say, recognizing or accepting PCR certificates from African countries. At least most countries. So, instead of leaving the airport, they had to spend 1 night in a hotel. So they took the PCR test as soon as they arrived. Not like us. We took it the day after we... Yeah,
I think it's,
we got to Nonsan.
I think it's supposed to be the same day, but we arrived so late that they just pushed it to the next day.
Besides just quarantine and arrival and everything, what else have you experienced during the pandemic, do you think?
I mentioned it earlier, just the fact that we had to follow a lot of rules, and you mentioned also the stages. So when we first arrived, actually the stages were quite intense. Like it was no more than 4 people during the daytime to meet, and no more than 2 people past 6 p.m. So when you first arrive in the country, you don't know anyone, and you're trying to make friends, but then it's like hard to connect with people because there's just so many barriers between, like, I can't spend time with much people. And also I think the reception of Korean people facing us, they kind of thought that we would bring COVID with us, even if like we passed through such like intense like quarantine and like testing. I think it was just so associated in people's mind that the virus was coming from abroad that you could feel like the tension, like people were uncomfortable with us, kind of.
Yeah, and also there were a lot of guidelines, like gatherings and all that stuff. But what I felt, I don't know if you think the same, what I felt, at least in the place where we were living, those guidelines were only for foreigners. So for example, gatherings up to 4 people. Let's say we were taking a class, Korean class, and then we were living the building, and there were 5 of us instead of 4, then someone would call us, even take a picture of us. What are you doing? Why are you gathering? Don't you know that that's not okay, blah, blah. But then we could see 40 Korean guys playing football or playing basketball, and that was totally okay. I don't know if it's because it was a small city and there were not police officers, let's say. maybe in Seoul it was different. I don't know. And I felt really, really, really disappointed because for someone who came to Korea for the first time, and most of us in that language school, well, it was the first time, they couldn't compare the situation.
It was like
Pre
their
and post
first experience here, yeah.
But for someone like me or for someone like Beckie, we can compare. And as she said before, I was also so happy when I came to Korea. I was so glad. Oh, this is a new country, totally different. And I was treated really well. But this time, the experience was totally different. So I felt that disappointment.
Yeah, I was not in a smaller city. I was in Daegu during the height of the pandemic. And I think that my friends and I were definitely really careful whenever we went out, even if we were just walking down the street, like in a larger group, because, that was not, we were very conspicuous when we walked down the street. Like, people notice you and they remember your face, right? How do you think it compares to like before the pandemic started?
One of the biggest difference from the first experience of Korea and the second is actually we had online classes for such a long time, because when we arrived it was like still the pandemic at its like peak kind of timing. So all our interaction in class were on Zoom instead of being in person, which makes a really different dynamic also when you're learning. So it's harder also to get to know the people that you're sharing a class with because you don't interact with them physically. Some people also had like harder time coming into Korea, so they were taking the Zoom classes but from their home country. So they had also to adjust their timing and make it fit with their schedule, which can be hard depending where they are in the world. And for sure, before the pandemic, it was way easier to travel and actually discover Korea, to go in different cities. Because with COVID, first of all, I think the will to go all around is less present. Like, you don't really want to, like, explore as much because you don't want to get COVID or, like, spread COVID for X reason if you, like, catch it. And also, it's just more complicated because you need to do like PCR tests if you travel from different cities, or at some point it just kind of make the experience less enjoyable if you do travel as much. And a lot of attractions are actually closed, so it's not the same experience in that way. After, I think it's the response of people, like when they see you. I felt like even if in Korea people are kind of not necessarily approaching people they don't know, you could still feel like that their body language, like they're not uncomfortable with you, or like they still accept you. But with COVID, like a lot of people just like were really avoidant. So it makes an atmosphere that is a little bit more heavier just in general.
She said that we had to take PCRs before traveling. That was because we were staying in the dorm. Those who were staying, because it was like a regulation. It's related to the topic. So most of us were staying in the dorm, at least for the first semester. And anytime we wanted to travel, we had to fill some kind of application, and we had to take a PCR before going back to the dorm, and we had to send it to the person in charge. But I made it way more difficult, but still I traveled a lot. I traveled a lot because I thought I was not going to catch COVID because I came from Spain and all my friends got it.
Right.
But I didn't. Even right before coming to Korea, I was about to miss my flight because a friend of mine got it. At the end, I caught it like a month ago. But the experience is different now. As she said, people, not most people, but some Koreans tend to avoid you just because of the fact that you are a foreigner. I can say that it's not that much about the pandemic or post-pandemic. Maybe it's because the place we were living. It was more the countryside, more city. they are not used to see foreigners that much, not, at least
Right.
not as much as in Seoul, I think international city. And now that we moved to Seoul, it's totally different. Completely
Really?
different.
Okay. I think it's interesting also talking about getting COVID. I did not get COVID. I was in China, I was in the US, then I was in Korea. And it was not until I went back to the US that I got COVID. Because nobody was wearing masks. That is something that I will say, like, Korea is really good with the mask mandates and people actually following them. Because I've noticed, even like at the beginning of the pandemic in the US, there were still a lot of people who were not willing to wear masks and people who did not really believe in the science of it and any of that. So it's really nice to be in a country where people are very mindful of like the good of the collective people rather than thinking about their own individual wants and needs. But that's a very, I guess, American thing, I think.
But like to add on that, like because when the COVID first started, I was in Canada, and actually our government kind of made a mistake that led people to be kind of on the fence with the mask, because instead of stating we are lacking masks for like the workers in the health industry, like the health sector, they decided to say it's not necessary to wear masks. It won't help. But then they backtrack when they got like sufficient like amount of masks. They were like, oh, it's mandatory. Everyone needs to wear it, and like it's really helping against the spread of COVID. But it was too late because some people already had like preconceived ideas that, well, we didn't need it at first, so why would we need it now? Right. And there was a lot of people kind of rebelling, and I was working in a store actually back in that time, and the number of people that were coming up without masks, and it was like a kind of an everyday thing to be like, no, you need to really use the hand sanitizer at the entrance, you really need to wear your mask, and it was kind of a struggle. I feel like you said, it divided people kind of. Some people were like, no, you absolutely need it, and some people were like, oh, it's not necessary.
Right. Whereas here I feel like people, for a lot of people now, it's almost like second nature to wear the mask and to use the hand sanitizer and to really like make sure that you have every base covered, basically. Yeah.
But it's a cultural thing, you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Even before the pandemic, they were used to wear the masks. Anytime they caught a cold, they just didn't want it to spread the illness or the cold or whatever it was, so they were used. Whereas, I don't know for you, but it was the first time I used the mask when the pandemic started. The first time in my life.
In what ways would you say like the big city is different from the smaller cities?
In the smaller cities, it happened more often. I know it happened also in big cities, but to be just like refused to enter places. So a lot of like restaurants would be like not even speaking, they just make you an X sign.
Yeah.
They don't talk to you, they just go away.
Even if you speak Korean.
Yeah.
And that's what I did.
Right.
Like, there are 4 of us. So, why? But in Korean, of course, in Korean language. Why? There are Koreans sitting there. Why can't we get in? Like, okay. And in a normal situation, I would have confronted them, but I didn't waste my time because I know it's useless.
Right.
They are not used to see foreigners, and if they don't want to let you in, they would just like X.
I think also one of the frustration was certain places where actually you could go if Koreans were not there. So if they have no customers, they let you in, but as soon as they have other customers, then they refuse you and they don't want you to enter. So it's kind of a little bit disappointing and frustrating when you like used to go to a place and then suddenly they're like, oh no, but not now, like
Right.
you can't come. So
Because they feel that they would make less profit. Because Koreans will not come if they see a foreigner inside.
But when you came to the bigger cities, did you find you could go to places more freely?
the look that people gave you is just more like a normal gaze. I don't know how to explain it. It's like instead of being like having fear or just like being avoidant, they would just like, you know, either like ignore like a normal person, like if you pass by, like they don't react necessarily to your presence, or just be kind, which is like if you're being avoided and kind of put apart for X amount of months, then you feel like really warm and welcome when you do experience like people that wants you there. I don't say that those people didn't exist in Nonsan, for example. Like there were people that were welcoming and that were like super happy to see foreigners. Like there's like shop owners or like cafe owners that were really welcoming, and even like some people in our staff, like they wanted to still interact with us. It's not that they wanted to completely put us apart, but it's just that those few amount of people that refuse you are the ones that will impact your experience.
Right. It's a lot easier, I think, to remember the negative experiences that you have because they affect you more, right?
Because as she said, there was a restaurant in Nonsan. The owner is a lady. I don't know how old is she, but maybe she's on her 60s or even 70s. And she welcomed us like, I think I've never seen anyone like her in Korea. So she's calling us son now. She calls me son now. So that's the opposite of what I experienced in Nonsan, at least most of the people I met. And also what she says at the staff of the university, for example, I felt that it was not their fault. They were just following orders from those in charge. They were just doing their job, but at the same time, they were discriminating us.
Would you say, like, from the beginning of the pandemic till now, things have changed or gotten better as people are, growing more used to it, and also as maybe different policies have been lightening up and things like that?
Definitely. It's again about culture. Not only Koreans, but East Asians tend to follow rules, and they follow them as a group, as a whole. Even now, the mask mandate has changed. We can remove our masks outdoors, but still you can see the most people is still using it. It's also because of the government. So when they say, okay, no more, let's say the stage thing we had before, then the society as a whole, Korean society as a whole, think, okay, let's relax a bit. Or masks, okay, we can relax. But we are not used to that, and we tend not to follow rules. Not everybody, but we are more like independent, let's say. So, and that's the biggest change that I saw is related to the law. So what I feel is that the government or politicians should be aware of not only what Koreans feel, but what foreigners feel, because the number of foreigners living in Korea is increasing. But yeah, I definitely can see the change, and I want the whole situation to change even more to a better point, not to what we had in the past, because that's impossible. The relation between beings, people, it's really sad, but it's getting better now, so I'm glad.
Going off of that a little bit, how would you say the pandemic response in Korea compares to the pandemic response in your home country?
Like I mentioned earlier about Canada, like I think that the response of Canada was kind of slow compared to the Korean response. Like especially in the beginning of the pandemic, I think like Korea was like so on top of their game. Like, oh, we need to like intervene because if not, it will become an issue. So they avoided a lot of like major outbreaks, I think, in the beginning. Whereas like in Canada, we kind of looked at it from afar and be like, it will be fine, nothing will happen, which obviously was not going to go that way. Like the government was always kind of taken aback each step we were going in, but I feel like in the long run, after like those like policies were in place, Canada dealt kind of well with what was happening. There was no like as much major outbreaks, I feel, back home. then like I feel that Korea had some peaks, but it's definitely also due to the fact that Korean population is so much higher. So if you take a city like Seoul, we don't have like such populated and dense area. Like Canada's pretty low density population. So yes, we have big cities, but like it can't be compared in a way for the number of like outbreaks. Also, Korea maintains their policies for longer. Definitely, like we see it with the mask mandate that is still on. I think that one of the reasons why Korea is maintaining it easily compared to the West in general is that people are so reticent to wear the mask that they're just like getting actually issues where people were like rebelling.
Yeah, no social pressure.
Yeah, so because they didn't want to also lose the public's like interest, or not interest, but they don't want to disappoint their population. They don't want to make the population raging also. They were just like, let's avoid the issue and let's just like, you know, start already returning to normal.
In Spain, well, I can compare Korea to Spain because we have more or less the same population. So, and same. The response in Spain was really, really slow, even they were denying. The problem with Spain is that we have 19 different governments. Each region has its own government, its own healthcare system. So they were fighting between them, the Spanish government and some regional governments. So the response was not as good as it had to be. And then we had a breakout in, how can I say that, like elderly care centers.
Yeah, like old folks' homes and things like that.
Yeah, and there were huge breakouts and a lot of people died. So if I compare it to Korea, there were like massive testings, but it has also a con. It's that while in Europe most of us got COVID, in Korea they had no cases, and then when people started catching the virus, then it got really, really bad. Maybe I think it was January.
Yeah, it was around there.
Yeah, more than 500,000 cases a day, or 500,000, 400,000. I don't know how many people passed away in Korea, but of course the number in Spain, of course, is much higher. I think it's more than 100,000 people now.
As someone from the USA, I think most people know that the USA was really bad with how we dealt with COVID. Again, like a really delayed response to it, and you know, just so many people passed away, and like we just did not have the resources really. Like our healthcare system was not equipped to account for all of these people getting sick all at once. So going from the US, I started out in the US during COVID, and then I came to Korea, and I would say it was a big shock coming here, where again everyone follows the rules and wears the masks and, you know, like tries really hard to not spread the virus, whereas in the US it was more like, oh, if I get it, and like, you know, I won't die, so I don't really care. Like a lot of people were very selfish in that way in the US, and still I feel kind of are. Whereas here, you know, you don't see that as much. And I remember there's an interactive COVID map in Korea that you can see how many cases there are for each city for each day. And I sent a screenshot of that when I first got here to my parents, and they did not believe it. They were like, there's no way that, because when I came, it was in October 2020, and I think like at that time, at least in Daegu, the cases were in like the single digits per day. So it was really well contained at that time, and they just could not believe that was even possible, because in the US the numbers were out of control. So
the response of the Korean government was really good. I don't know if China, the response is similar in China. Maybe they are taking it to a more extreme level. To me, it's also a bit extreme in Korea. At least with the mask mandate. But I was also I got shocked when I went back to Spain. It was June. I was used to live here. Like everybody was wearing the mask, including myself, of course. And then I went to Spain. I remember that I did the layover in Paris. So when I took the flight from Paris to my city in Spain, nobody was wearing the mask, even the stewards. So I was like,
It's like a whole new world.
yeah, like, where am I? Should I wear it? And then of course in Spain, nobody was wearing it outdoors. And now I think we are allowed not to wear even indoors.
In Spain?
And I think in whole Europe, most countries at least.
Yeah. I don't know if the US was the first to do away with the mask mandate, but yeah, like for a while now, that people in the US have not been wearing masks. And I think another thing that Korea did really well that worked for this particular situation, I guess, is the contact tracing.
That's true.
Yeah, where whenever you entered any sort of shop or, especially restaurant, you had to scan your information and, give your phone number and all of that so you could get contacted if someone got COVID in your immediate vicinity. Obviously, that kind of thing would not fly in the US and maybe a lot of Western countries, but I know especially in the US, there are a lot of people who are very concerned with their personal privacy, and they don't think that the government has any business knowing where they've been and where they're going and all of that. So unfortunately, a policy like that probably would not work in the United States. But I think that's a big reason why things didn't spread so quickly in Korea as well, because they could locate where COVID had been and they could shut it down really quickly and tell people to quarantine or get tested,
Yeah, I think those two things combined, like the fact that they could trace where people with COVID went, and also the massive testing. I know that in Canada, like we didn't have as much testing than Korea, so obviously if you can't test people, then they might not know they have COVID and they think like, oh, I just have a cold, or like it's like mild symptoms, and then they go around and then that's where it spreads to other people. So it made it more of an issue. And in I can't talk more specifically of Quebec because like that's where I am in Canada, and like every province has their own policies also regarding COVID, and their healthcare system is different. But for us, the houses for old people, we also had that issue where like a lot of people died there because the workers actually we lack so much workers there that they pass from one center to the other. So because they pass from a center to the other, then if they do catch COVID, then they bring it with them like in all the places they worked. So it just spread so easily, and because that population is so vulnerable, there was a lot of deaths related to that. And I think that our healthcare system had the huge pressure, and like there was not a lot made to help those workers that were overworked, and like really I think a lot of them kind of burnt out.
So what do you think can be learned from the successes and the failures of these policies?
I would say that in a situation like this where mostly all people were dying, or still they are dying, we should protect them. And I think it's really selfish to only think about yourself, because at least in Spain, when I was in Spain, the biggest concern for me was to protect my relatives, my grandma and her husband at the time. And I was so worried, like, oh my God, I'm not gonna meet my friends, because if I catch the virus and then I spread to my grandma, I can kill her actually. And that's why I think the policies in Korea were really like decisive to this matter. And that's one thing we should learn, to protect the elderly even more. And then this pandemic taught us to value things more, because you don't know when you can get sick or even die or even lose your relatives. Luckily, I haven't. None of my relatives passed away. Actually, I'm the only one who caught the virus.
Wow.
as far as I know. So yeah, we should value things more, and also we should treat everybody the same, regardless of nationality, or even if they caught the virus. Like, this person caught it, but you can catch it also.
I think that one thing to learn from all this situation is also to have early reaction to events such as COVID. So that's why I think Korea made such a success with preventing a lot of cases happening, because they were so involved early on, and they didn't just like watch from afar and see where it goes. Like that's generally ending up in like higher problematics later on. Whereas like it's better to avoid like the like worst scenario possible, to just actually be involved. And also I think to keep the population really aware of what's happening, instead of like, oh, we're going to deal with it and like just follow the rule. Like the more involved people are, the more they will follow the rules, and the more like they want to participate, and they will understand why it's important to actually react. Also for foreigners here, I know that one of the reasons why Korea was so harsh on foreigners is that there's a few groups of people that were not respecting at all any of the mandates. It's important to showcase your best behavior, especially when you're not in your own country. You can't act when like whatever you want to do.
Right. We, in a sense, I mean, I don't mean for it to sound pretentious maybe, but we are ambassadors of our country to like the local people here, and so we also need to remember that we are guests in this country, you know. Even if we do live here and we do, you know, contribute to the society in certain ways, you have to be respectful of the country that you're living in. So I think that's a really good point, that, yeah, like there definitely were certain people who were crossing certain lines that they shouldn't have crossed, and going out when they shouldn't have. And unfortunately, as I previously mentioned, with foreigners, like you are just so visible in this society, because especially if you're a foreigner who doesn't necessarily look very Korean, you know, people are going to remember your face. It's something that's out of the ordinary, so you're going to get recognized. And unfortunately, that is something that does stick in people's heads, and that is really easy to point fingers at. It's really hard to point fingers at a virus, you know, but it's really easy to blame people for certain problems, you know.
It would be wonderful to be treated the same way as others in every single place, but that's impossible.
Right.
That's impossible. Well, not only the Korean politicians or the Korean government, every single government in the world is to make policies so nobody feels discriminated, at least because it's a really bad thing. It's a virus. Everybody's getting sick, and in the case of Korea, I felt really disappointed when they started using the COVID pass, and those of us who got the vaccine abroad couldn't get it. I don't know if that was your case, but it was my case.
I got vaccinated in Korea actually, so I did not experience that, but I know that my friends who came later on definitely had problems with it.
I did, and I was so stressed. And also, again, talking about policy, I think Korea is one of the only countries, among the, say, developed countries, I think also Japan, they don't have a specific law to prevent crimes or against foreigners or racism or discrimination. So it would make a huge difference if they had this kind of policy. Korea is a really good place to live, but this is one of those things that I'm not comfortable with. And in every place, also in Spain, there are a lot of racism going on in Spain, and I feel really disappointed, first as a Spanish and then as a human being, to like, why would you treat a person in a different way just because of their like ethnicity? So
it's true. I don't think like any store or restaurant could state like, oh, no foreigners. When you're, for example, you take the US, you take Canada, you take Europe, such things couldn't happen because there's laws, like it's actually, you call the police, like it's forbidden to not let someone enter based on like where they're from.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess you have also the same feeling in the US, like the concept of foreigner itself is not such a thing because you don't know anyone can have different background and still be American or Canadian. So I think that's also because Korea is so homogenous, like it's easy to spot like, oh, this one is not from here.
You know, US society is definitely built on the whole like, oh, you know, anyone can come here and make something of themselves and we accept all different nationalities, but at the same time there are so many problems with American society in particular and racism and things that have definitely come to the forefront in recent years. And I think actually interestingly with COVID, something that was a big issue was racism against Asian people. So it's almost the opposite of what was happening here in Korea, and to a more severe degree because you saw certain like even hate crimes happening in the US, which was really scary for a lot of people. Like it even did affect like my family and my friends. Like I have family and friends who are Asian who would be scared to like go certain places. Here in Korea, even though we do experience certain types of discrimination, it's not like I ever fear for my safety. In fact, in Korea, I feel safer here as a woman than I do feel in the US. Like, I would walk down the street at night here. I don't know if I would necessarily do that in certain parts of the US. I guess it's just an interesting thing, and it's not necessarily confined to one certain nation or group of people. It's just like a natural human tendency to do that. The last question I wanted to ask was just, in the future, where do you think we can go from here in terms of either a collective global society, if you want to go that route, or just as the perception of foreigners in Korea?
I think the pandemic made us go backwards. We should be going towards the future, progressing, but this thing made us go back to the past. So I think now that the situation is getting better, I hope, and I believe that we will learn from these experiences. Also, in talking about Korea, politicians should make a law to prevent discrimination and crimes against foreigners. As you said before, it's not as severe as in the US, of course. Nobody's killing foreigners like just because of their eyes or the skin color. But still, they have to make some progress. They still need time. I understand that it's as Beckie said before, it's a homogeneous society, not as in the US or in some European countries where everyone has a different background. They need time in Korea, but I believe and I hope that this will change in the next, let's say 10 years or 15 years.
COVID was kind of also like of a break, not a break, but like a pause in where in general society was going in whichever country. And I think it's the time to reflect on where do we want to go forward, like not just continue in the same tracks and be like learning from, oh, this break allows me to find my priorities and redirect myself. So there was also a lot of changes with like the environment because like the industries were like on pause and things like that. I think that it's things that we should learn from and also realize like, oh, we should value time with your family. We should value time like with nature. We should like make more space for those things and not just rush in and like work and pushing the capitalism. I mean, I think that there's also a beauty into producing and like moving forward, like you said. But I think that there's like a more maybe human way and more conscious way for us to continue, and also to keep in mind like what we face with the pandemics and learn from that. So if we ever face another pandemic or another situation which is similar, that we'll have like a early on response and also a collective response, because I think that governments from all around the world should just be more collaborative with one another, so they can help each other in many ways and learn from each other.
Cooperation, international cooperation was at its peak during the first months of the pandemic.
It was like almost uniting against a common enemy, I guess.
For the first time since
Right.
World War II, let's say. So.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. Thank you for your time and for your thoughts.
Thanks for having us here.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.